With Blender, you wield the power of a god. You can forge a new homeworld for the default cube to call their own.
Okay, brilliant. I loved making this and I'm sure you guys will love it as well. This is me from the future basically coming back and saying this is going to be a longer format video than I usually do, and I want to know whether you actually find that helpful, having a longer format video, or whether you'd like shorter videos, or whether you just like the variety. Happy either way. I'm going to put timestamps to relevant sections down in the description so you can jump to appropriate places in the tutorial, the physics tutorial. Gets a bit quirky from time to time, but I really enjoyed it and I really hope you do too. Remember, if you've liked the video, to give it a like, and I'll see you back when we're done. Okay, so this is lots of fun to make and I'd love to see what you guys come up with. Let's crack on. First of all, we are going to do a couple of things that I've learnt the hard way not to do. So first of all, we're going to move our cube into its own collection, and we're going to call it cube, of course. And when it's in its own collection, it basically means we can toggle it on and off. We've got a default collection with the camera and default light in the scene as well, so we don't need to worry about selecting those accidentally. We can just turn them off. The next thing that I'd recommend is going to the materials, because we're going to set up a material in a bit that changes color based upon how far it is away from being crushed in at the core. I'm going to call this cube, so once again it's identifiable, and then I'm going to duplicate my cube, but I'm going to duplicate it with Alt and D so that it is a linked duplicate. The reason for that is I do not want the mesh data or the material data to become a different version, otherwise that will ruin what we need to do. I'm going to move these two cubes either side. Now, before we go and duplicate hundreds and hundreds of cubes up, the first thing I want to say is make sure you've got all of your settings roughly right before you do a ton of duplication. Otherwise, it just gets slow to fix. It's possible to fix, but it'll be slow. Go over to the physics tab, and when we're in the physics properties, I'm going to go to rigid body, and then let's have a look at these options down here. The shape of the collision I'm going to set as a box collision. I'm going to leave the mass at 1 kilo. Make sure dynamic is ticked, otherwise it won't animate using the physics. And then we're going to go down surface response. I do want things to bounce off of one another, so I'm going to turn this bit up. And friction I'm also going to turn off. I want them to grip a little bit as they collide with one another. The sensitivity, I'm not going to touch that. I found leaving it as is absolutely fine. Collections we're going to ignore, and then dynamics. This one is important. So we've got the dampening of the translation, and what this will do is slow things down over time, which is useful for making your animation a lot shorter. Ultimately, we want everything crushing into the center, so we want it to slow down over time. I'm going to leave these as default. If you want it to happen quicker, you can increase these values, and the rotation as well. If that is really high, if something is rotating, it will just naturally slow down. And that might ruin the illusion if that's too high. Right, we've got our two cubes in the scene. Let's just press the space bar or the play button down here. One of them's going to fall and one of them's going to stay still. Okay, that's the first thing we need to sort out. So things are currently falling based upon gravity. If we go to our scene properties, we can turn gravity off. When we turn that off, we can press play again and nothing happens. Perfect. Now the other thing is this cube here doesn't have any physics on it at the moment. If you do happen to come across this later on, you want to make some more duplicates and you want to copy whatever your original source cube has, because the linked duplicate won't copy physics properties over, we simply select one of the items that we want to inherit those physics properties, then select one that has it. So we've got the dark orange around the one that's selected and the lighter orange around the one that is the active object. Then we can press F3 for searching and copy rigid body settings. As you can see, that's the last thing I searched for, and that will copy them across. Now when we have a look at this cube, it will also have a rigid body under the physics tab with exactly the same settings we had before. Make sure you save often as well, because I've done this process before. There were quite a few thousand cubes in the scene, but it did crash Blender. Okay, so the next thing to do is to add a force field into our scene. So I'm going to go Shift A and add in a force field, and we're going to make it a standard force. Now this is cheating slightly because the cubes are not being attracted to one another. However, if you do try to give each individual cube a force field, I found Blender doesn't like that at all. So we're going to do it this way to get things done. The field itself, I'm going to click and drag it into the collection. No, I'm going to leave it where it is at the moment and create a new collection called field. The reason for that is to keep things separate, and also if I were to put it in collection but hide collection, the field would stop working. Okay, so now this field is here. Let's just press space and see what happens. But I'm going to rewind first. I think it's important to make sure you always rewind as you're doing this. Otherwise, you won't see the true effect of what's going on. Especially true of moving objects around as well in a bit. So they're being pushed apart. We don't want them to be pushed apart. We want them to be pulled together. So we're going to go to the strength field on the right hand side here. I'm actually going to go really high from experience, about -500. These cubes are going to slam into one another. They'll bounce off and eventually settle together. And perfect, there you go, job done. Not quite. Let's go ahead and duplicate these. There are a couple of ways we can go ahead and duplicate these cubes. I thought the quickest way was going to be code, but it turns out it's not. It's quite easy to hide our field out of the way, select both the items, you can press the A key as well, and go Shift D. And we can place them here if we like. Then we can select everything again, Shift D, select everything again, Shift D. And before you know, you've got quite a few. So with those selected, I can just go Shift D, escape. And if I lean over my keyboard and do that a few times, you can see at the bottom here, the numbers are adding up and up and up. You can see I'm already at 304. Now you may want to separate these out into little clusters as you're doing that, or we can go F3 with some of these items selected and randomize the transform. By doing that, we can place them in random positions. I'm going to go to the operator panel and change the location here. I'm just going to spread it out over 20 cubic meters, and there we go. We've got some cubes there. I'm going to select everything and do exactly the same thing again. So F3, randomize transform. Let's give this a larger number. There we go. So all of these cubes are going to come in and collide with one another, which is pretty awesome. I'm going to make that a bit smaller to begin with, because what I also want to do is now duplicate that a couple of times. I used the wrong duplicate there, Alt and D. So these are all going to collapse in on one another. And let's take a look here down at the objects. There's now 1,500 objects in the scene. The title scene that you saw had 7,000 in it. And that took a while to sort out. I wouldn't recommend going quite that high unless you've got quite a powerful machine. I'm going to try and stay around 2,000 objects. I like what we've got there, and now I'm going to zoom out, but things are going to disappear. So I'm going to open up my properties panel with the N key, go to view, go to the N setting on the view, and set it to about 5 kilometers or 5,000 meters. Now we can zoom out quite easily. And I'm going to set another group of these quite far away, all the way over here. So as these are coalescing and coming together, this other ball is just going to fly in at quite high speed. Let's just see how this looks so far. And with these extra objects in our scene, I am expecting it to be a little bit slower. We can see we're currently running at 25 frames per second. And nothing's really happening. These are all floating apart. And the reason for that is earlier on, and this is the reason why we group things together, I had turned off the visibility of my field. So if I turn that back on, now press play, they get sucked in, and very quickly we should end up with a ball of something going on here. And I love how it looks like, oh look, we got a little moon. Smash! Wow. Oh, that's a shame. I really wanted to know what happened. So in our scene properties on the right hand side, let's open up our rigid body world. And go down to the cache. If we go down to the cache, we can see there's 250 frames in memory. If we don't change this, we won't be able to run the simulation. I'm going to set it to 3,000 frames, and I'm going to change the endpoint here to also 3,000. Now, one thing to bear in mind here is my frame rate is currently 30 frames per second. And when I put this video together, I want to include everything that I've got here when I render it out. So I am going to set my frame rate as well. So under the output tab, I'm going to change my frame rate here to 30 frames per second. You can pick whatever you like. Bear in mind, the higher that is, the longer it will take to render your scene. So for instance, if I was to run this at 60 frames per second, I'd require twice as many frames as the 30 frames per second one. Okay, so now this is here. Let's go ahead, rewind it and press play. So we'll see them all smashing together. And this is a lot quicker than it was before. And the reason for that is it has already cached this information. It's going to splat and hopefully this lot will coalesce back in once again. And having that really high strength to the field at 500 is going to really help these come back together again. So I think that's a really successful animation there. Do any of these end up orbiting? Sometimes it's really awesome if we do have a couple that end up whizzing round, or a group of them that end up going round. So it doesn't look like we've got anything specific doing it. They're all kind of just bouncing off. So one thing we can do here is add an additional field. So I'm going to rewind it back to the beginning. It is really important that you do that, otherwise some things can get very quirky. Let's look at everything from the top and focus on whatever I've got selected. Okay, that's that group over there. Let's come in here. Now, it doesn't really matter where we place our field because we're not going to base anything upon its position, just the direction it's having an effect on. So if we go ahead, add another force field, this time it's going to be a wind, and I'm going to drag that straight into the fields and name it straight away as well, wind. I'm going to go GX and pull it out over here. Then I'm going to zoom in. Currently it's facing down or up. Which way are we round? It's facing up at the moment. So I'm going to rotate it on the x-axis by 90. Now it's facing in the negative y direction, and I'm going to give it a force. So let's go to the physics properties. So for the shape is a plane, it's just going to force everything as if it was just shoving it across the entire world. The strength I'm going to set quite high. I'm going to set at 5,000. But if we leave it like that, watch what happens. We press play and everything starts to coalesce, but then disappears into the distance because it's got that constant force acting on it. So in order to get around that, we're going to animate the force. So we're going to animate its effect on location and rotation. If we change the strength, it will slow everything down, and we don't want that. Now let's key in with the I key, affect location and affect rotation. Then I'm going to go to maybe frame 20 and turn those off. Turn them off, then key them in, and we can see they've gone yellow. So from frame 1 all the way through to frame 19, they will be on, and then 20 they get turned off. That might be too long. We can adjust it by just clicking and dragging the keyframe there. Okay, so let's go ahead and press play and see what happens. Awesome. So that's been shoved that direction. Where's the other group? Okay. Now this is why it might be slightly too long. It might take a while for these to actually come in. But this currently looks like it's going to be kind of a blob orbiting quite far out. And I do want it to come in a little bit sooner than that. Oh, it is slowing down quite a bit. We can see that dampening on the linear velocity really having effect here. So this is oscillating and going backwards and forwards, which is awesome. And this is already quite close. So it's really slowing down and spiraling in. The problem with that, of course, is we're not getting that smash that we had before, because now it is just going round and round in circles and slowly spiraling in, which doesn't give us quite the same effect. So I am going to I'm going to pause, rewind back to the beginning and change this from frame 20 to frame 5 or thereabouts. Let's press play and watch it now. So it's been given a slight shove. So instead of it having this really wide arc that it had before, it's going to come in and do a glancing blow. So it'll definitely miss the first time round, and then hopefully it'll come back in and completely smash this thing apart. But it'll add some visual interest as well. As it comes past, we can perhaps have it heat up and glow differently. So I think this is going to work pretty well. Here it comes. Oh, just missed. So I'm going to change this again ever so slightly because I do want it to smash sooner than that. Let's zoom in a little further change this keyframe here, push it back even further, maybe even only have it, what's that, over 3 frames, or we could reduce the strength of it. I'm going to press play here and see what happens, and also talk about caching. So for the moment, we've got this that's running around and it's automatically baking this information as we go. We can't see that anywhere at the moment until we go back to the scene tab, and we can see there are 400, here we go, it's counting up now, 500, etc. frames in memory. Now, whenever we make any changes to the physics system, we should really make sure that everything is deleted and then it starts off again. If that doesn't happen, you can end up with some real quirks happening. And I have had things not respond to changes before. There's a couple of ways of potentially reviving your physics simulation. Worst case scenario, you can't do it. We can remove the rigid body world, but unfortunately that will also remove any of the settings you had on your objects as well, which isn't that great. We're going to try to avoid that. Is it going to smash here? Oh, so close. So what are we on at this point? Nearly 2000 frames. Okay. The other way that we can sort things out is we can delete all bakes and then toggle gravity on and off. Ah, yes. So the smash is happening around 2000. And then everything is going to come back in, and it might disrupt it a little. It does. I think 3000 is going to be quite good for this. If we extend it a little further, we might be able to have it cool down over a longer period. Perhaps this will be okay though. We'll test this out when we get to the materials part. Okay, so I'm happy with that overall. Maybe extend this later on. Yes, so what I do want to do is just finish off the baking here. So I'm going to click bake. Now, before you ever do any animations or rendering when it comes to having cached data, I'd always recommend that you bake it in. The downside of this is if you then save it along with your blend file, you can find it takes up quite a large space. So the blend file that I have for the video you watched at the very beginning is nearly 4 gigabytes. It's 3.7 gigabytes in its actual size, and that's because of the cache, the location of all of these physics movements. We can see that's completed the cache there. That is 122 megabytes, not bad. RAM usage can creep up massively as well, so that's something to watch out for when you're doing this. Brilliant. So I'm happy with how that all works. We can always play it back now because it's been cached. It will play back really smoothly. It also means we can jump to frame 2000 and just watch it from there because it has all been cached. Now, I'm not going to make any other changes at the moment. I'm going to leave it as is and I'll work with this. So let's go over to the fun bit, which is shading. Now, I am going to use some things that I'm not sure whether they work in Eevee actually, but I am going to work in cycles for mine. So I'm going to switch over to cycles and let's just have some of the objects all scattered about, which they currently are. They're not scattered about massively, but we can still work with that. So let's go over to the shading tab. Looks slightly different to normal. That's so my head fits down in the lower corner. Okay, so let's zoom out and see what we've got. Let's select here one of our objects and it should be the cube. I'm going to click a few just to double check. Excellent. So we're not working with the principled BSDF. Let's get rid of that and let's add in an emission shader. Here we go. Let's plug that in. And then we're going to control the color using a few separate nodes. So the first node I'm going to do is an input node. It's going to be the texture coordinate. Excellent. So there we go. And we're going to use the objects, as in the object itself, its location. But if we plug that in, oh wow, that looks pretty funky. That's not going to work for us. And in fact, if we were to then use a color ramp, which we'll get to in a bit, camera data is not what I wanted. Let's search for color ramp. Here we go. If we plug that in, that's also not what we want. We can see here that each object, it's having a cross section put across it. Oh, not really a cross section either, a sort of arc put across it. And we want all of these objects. So instead of just the individual object, we want to select an object here and we will use our field, the one in the center of our scene. Let's go ahead and add that. The moment we do that, we get this massive division across the two. And the reason for that is because we're plugging a vector, this object is outputting 3 values, and it's being forced into a single value. And that's the result you get. But instead of doing that, we can do some vector math to straighten this out. So let's go ahead, go to vector. It's not under there, it's under converter, vector math. We add that in, and instead of having it set to add, we can set it to the length. And let's plug these two things back together. Okay, you won't see anything for the moment because the value at which this is going from black to white is right in the middle of all of that lot. So we need to stretch this out. There are a couple of ways of doing that. You could divide, and when you divide, you're actually dividing by the number of blender units wide you want the color ramp to be affected over. So let's go in and go ahead and grab a math node. So once again, under converter, let's do math, plug that in and go to divide. And if we increase this value to something like 50, we can see that it's starting to be darker in the middle, which is not what we want. We want it the other way around. So we can change it over here to flip the color ramp, down arrow here, flip the color ramp. Now things that are further away are darker. Now we can't see in this view, so I'm going to open up the side panel here and set the view distance to 5000 again. And we should, if we can find the other one, see that it's black. And we can see here, this is 10, 20, no, this is 100, 200, 300, 400, 500. If we set this to 500, that will also start, 5000. Now it's white. We drag it down eventually when we get to about 500. There we go. That is black there. And as we extend that further, there we go. Around 700 or so, that starts lightening up the outer reaches over here. We obviously don't want it stretched out over that length. And I've actually found by playing with these, and that's the key here, play with it and see what you get, a logarithm. So a curve that's steep initially and then flattens out. Logarithm tends to work really well for this, and we're going to have a much lower value. So let's lower that down until we start getting some black around the fringes, more variation. Otherwise it looks too uniform, and that's not great. Okay, so we've got all the bits and bobs that we need here. Let's add some colors in. So I'm going to hit the plus button a couple of times, and I'm going to stretch these out ever so slightly so we can play with these individual colors. I do want the middle to be white, so I'm going to leave it like that. And let's just make this one yellow, maybe a bright red as well. And then we want sort of a darker red, as if it's cooling down, and maybe even a bluish hue in here as well. I am just playing with this. Colors can be pretty awesome, so do play with them and see what you get. So I want this sort of burning out, and we can see in the middle here. Look at this. This is already coming together really well. This looks pretty awesome. And I'm going to change this value down here, and we can see that it is affecting all of this. And if we play back, we can see that is awesome already. It needs a bit more variation. As I was saying, it's very uniform at the moment. Whoosh, as that goes past. And obviously when it comes in closer, it will heat up, it will start glowing and go smash as it comes through. So I think we can play with this a bit more by adding in a random selection of colors. So let's go ahead. Let's first of all add in a mix RGB node and place it just before the color ramp itself. Then we're going to add in the color to is going to be from the object. So I'm searching in this case rather than going for the input area, but the object info itself gives us a random color for each object. And if we plug it into the color, we start to get a bit of an interesting selection going on. This is about to come back and smash us, I think. Or almost is, but I'm going to change this from mix to multiply, and I'm going to increase this slightly so we get more areas that are glowing. I found around 80% is a good figure, so we're on 83% just there. Let's press space now and see what happens. Oh, it just missed, so it still has some hot bits in it. Perhaps lowering this figure down now, so we get some areas that are a bit darker. And again, this is entirely up to you now to start tweaking and working out what type of colors you're going to suit your scene the best. That was a close call. Okay, so we can play with quite a few different options here in order to get the right look, and it can take a lot of tweaking depending on your scene itself. I found logarithm works for some things. I found that divide works in other places, especially when you start adding the random in and perhaps turning it up a little. And also remember, you can play with the emission strength as well, and we can make it a lot brighter. So maybe crank that up to 50 or so, especially in the initial stages. Let's see what that looks like. In fact, let's rewind and go back to the beginning and just see what that looks like. This time turning cycles on, so it'll be a bit slower to update. So we've got this pink and purple shade going on there. I'm happy with that for the moment, but I want it to be a bit more impactful by going to the scene settings and turning the background color to black. Okay, now let's go ahead and render that out and see what it looks like. We'll probably find that our camera is far too close to the scene. Yes, it is. Okay, so let's go and have a look through the camera view with the 0 on the numpad. And everything goes black. And the reason for that is under the camera settings, which we can now have a look at. Similar to the viewport settings, we need to change the clipping distance. So start clip and end clip, and I'm going to set this at 5000. There we go. That's starting to look pretty good. I'm going to bring that out a little bit further and look down. So up and down is the Q and E key, and then the W, A, S, and D. Okay, so that's everything in the scene. I can render that out now and have a look roughly at what it's going to look like. And we will play with the compositor in a bit to make it look a little bit better. I don't like those pinks and purples when it's rendered out. So I'm going to go back into my shading tab quickly, select one of my cubes, and I'm going to change this purple here to maybe a darker blue. We can see when we increase the emission strength, it's actually changing the value here. It's boosting this and making it a lot brighter. So I don't want that at all. I want to keep these in the red range and not drifting over to the purple. There we go. I want this to look more and more like molten rock and less purpley. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. I think this one here has got a slight hue shift that we need. Okay, that looks good. And I want to bring black up a little bit more so there is a definitive black area, and perhaps play with the different types of interpolation as well. Perhaps B-spline, cardinal, whatever you happen to pick here. Constant probably won't work. It'd be far too flickery as it goes between the various values. I think here I'm going to use B-spline. That seems to have a nice smooth gradient between all of these, and we can see they heat up as they come in. Yes, I'm liking the look of this. And then of course we can dim these over time as well as they start dying down. That's really nice. I like that. So we've got this set at 30. Did I have it? Look at that pulsing of colors. Oh, gorgeous. I can't wait to put this into the rendering at the end. Okay, so I'm happy with the overall transitions there and everything else that's going on. I'm going to render this out again. Let's have a look through the camera view. And let's go forward to a point where it's really interesting. So we can just scrub through. So these are going to heat up as they come past. That'll be quite interesting. But let's have it loop back again. And then where does it smash into it? It's about 2000, isn't it? So we've got it smashing and coming apart there. And of course you can be in the viewport shading mode if your computer can't handle quick updates of the Cycles render engine. Mine's doing remarkably well at the moment. Great work from the Blender devs there. Yeah, that looks awesome. So now comes the part where we can start animating things as well. So when we start, we don't want everything glowing bright in the middle. We want it to start glowing bright once everything crushes in. So we go back to our shading tab and also add in a timeline so we can keep track of things. Timeline here. Okay, so at frame 1, we want the strength here to be maybe 0. Let's set it at 0 and key that in with the I key. And then as we go forward, all of these things are crushed together. We can set this up to 30 and key that in. So from the beginning, it's going to brighten up really quickly. And then we're going to keep it as that for ages and ages until it smashes in and then dies out. So smashes here. In fact, we can start having it cool until it does hit again. That would be pretty awesome. So maybe around 1000 we start the cooling process. So we key in a value of 30, and then where does it hit again? So it hits here. So let's cool it down all the way to frame We don't want it to heat up before the impact. So about there, I think is... Oh, make sure we have the cursor over the point we want to key in. So we've got a strength of 30 just there. It's going to ramp back up because here it's going to be a strength of 0.5. So it's going to cool down. You see it cooling and cooling and cooling and cooling as... Oh, look, it gets bright too soon because it's ramping up between those two values. We want it to ramp up. Yeah, we want it to ramp up a bit better than that. Okay, so if you can't see any of your keyframes here, very simple, you've just not got the right thing selected. Now we can zoom into the appropriate area and start tweaking it. So we've got it reaching 0.5 here, and we want it to remain at 0.5 until the collision itself. So I'm going to duplicate those keyframes with Shift and D and pull them across. Now let's see what happens. Bang! It's going to brighten up. Not instantly, let's have it heat up over a couple of frames. Make sure you've got the right keyframe selected. Let's play that back. Bang. Okay, so that warms up. Awesome. I really like how that looks. And of course, in a moment, we can start it cooling down again after all of this activity that's gone on. So I'm going to zoom back out. Here we go. This would be a good place for it to just cool down. Let's make it 2600. I'm going to type in the value this time and key in that 30 value. And then let's just have it fade out over the next 400 frames. Let's have it fade out to maybe 0.1 of its original. So it still has a light glow to it. Okay, let's just watch that bit back. Perhaps not the whole thing, but to just get a feel of how that impact happens. Boom. Okay, that's still happening slightly soon. I'm going to go back in. I want it to heat up here instead. So I'm going to grab both of those and shift them along a little. Boom. Much better. Love it. Okay. So this is quite an interesting point here where it impacts. It spreads out like that. Let's render that out and then go into the compositor. Look how awesome that looks. Wow. Because I want to add a bit of glare to this. So in Eevee, you could add a bit of bloom. In fact, let's see how this looks in Eevee at the moment. I'm not sure if all of these nodes, I think all of these, I'm not sure if object info is supported by it. So let's go into Eevee, go to our render settings. No, it looks pretty good. Let's render that out. Okay, awesome. So you could play with this in Eevee as well and turn on, ooh, motion blur would be awesome. That's supported more in 2.9 at the moment. Let's go to our bloom. Would you look at that? That looks pretty intense. Smash. Oh, that's gorgeous. And then does it fade out over the next few? Oh, that is awesome. Perhaps it's an earlier version that it wasn't working on. Let's go right back to the beginning. So we've got all of this coming together. I think that could take a little longer to warm up. Let's put it that way. So let's zoom out, find that first keyframe here, because it's warming up during that time. I'm going to spread it all the way out to the first 10 seconds. Let's have it warm up during that period. But let's have it get higher. So we're going to go to frame 300. There we go. I want to get it all the way up to 50 on this first impact. Okay, let's go for that. So we've got all of these things coming together, warming up. It's going to get brighter and brighter and brighter. Maybe too bright. Oh, that's awesome there. I love this. And there we go. It's just a matter of rendering this out now as an animation. But I did want to go down the non-Eevee route and do the cycles route as well. So in the compositor itself, what we can do is turn on use nodes. Once we've done that, we've got our render layers here. And we can do a couple of things. I always like having an RGB curves in here. And with the RGB curves in here, we can change the overall contrast of the scene. Before I do anything else, I'm going to add in a viewer node. By adding in a viewer node, I can see what's going on. It'll put it in the background here, which is pretty awesome. Then I can move this lot to one side, click here, do that, and we can see we've affected how the scene is looking. So sometimes this is a great way of just color correcting your scene ever so slightly if it doesn't quite have the right contrast, as well as the normal filmic controls if you're playing with them. So I usually like having a slight curve, making things brighter in the middle, but where things are bright, let's have them have a bit of lens flare. So we want to add in a filter that's called glare. When we add that in, we probably don't want this one. We don't want streaks. What we want to change this to is fog glow. There we go. So when things are glowing, they've got a similar effect to how the bloom works in Eevee. Of course, when things die down later on in the scene, say 2750, and we render that one out, we can see it's still quite hot at that point, and it will also glow. And if we go to 3000 to see what that looks like and render that out, we can see that it won't have quite as much glow on it. In fact, it won't have any glow, which is perfect. That's exactly what we want. Okay, so I'm going to go and render this out now. Actually, before I do, I'm going to go to the brightest point, which is around frame 300, and I want to see what that looks like. Yeah, okay, that looks pretty neat. I'm going to go render this out now, and I'll see you back in a whatever 3 seconds time 3000 is. Oh, no, come back. I've got a tip here for you. Let's not render out 3000 frames. I need to stick to my own advice here. We don't want to render out every frame. So let's go to our output and change our step here to maybe 30 frames. Then it means every second is rendered out, and therefore it's going to be a lot quicker, and that will test the animation overall. So now when we render it, it's going to frame 0, 30, no, 1, 30, 60, 90, etc. So it's going to go through the entire thing very quickly, and by going through it very quickly, we can see what's going on, and we can also just check it for general interest. Is it too bright? I mean, some of these things will happen so quickly anyway, especially when it gets smashed into. It may just take too long to do, but you can already see we're a third of the way through. So this is great for testing. This actually looks a little bit boring until that thing comes flying past and ultimately ends up smashing into it in a bit. So at this point in time, it might be worth thinking about how else can we make this a little bit more interesting, although it just blobbing around in space. Oh, it's smashed there, so there is something interesting happening. I think if I was to redo this, I'll try and get things to smash together a little bit sooner, but the last time I did this, I ended up doing that by making sure, or keeping interest by adding 7,000 objects, which is quite a lot. So now that's been done, I can just either view it where I've outputted it, or just view the animation using the render tab here. So here we go. Okay, that doesn't want to play back. Let's go find it manually. So here we go. Here is the movie playing back. I'm using VLC to play it back, and it looks pretty good. Okay, that does swing past at one point. I think this might be glowing a bit much. I might turn the bloom settings down a little. But otherwise, that looks pretty good. At least it's playing back at real time, so I can see this is 1 minute and 39. I could play it back at 60 frames per second. It'd just be twice as quick. Might look a bit odd, but might also work. There we go. We have that whizzing past and disappearing into the ether. I love how that happens. And this is really your chance to look at how your final rendering output actually works and any tweaks that you could possibly end up doing to it. Smash! Haha, yes. I love that part of it. That's really nice. Now, I do think this is the bloom here is far too strong. It's covering up a lot of the texture on the surface. In fact, you could add a texture to this lot as well to give it a bit more of a molten look if you wanted to. We could go into one of the cubes and add a noise texture in, for instance. So noise texture. Add another mix RGB in. I like how that cools everything down, and just plug in the factor here. Look, we've got mini lava. How awesome is that? And of course you could animate this scale, or perhaps the detail, maybe not the detail, the distortion. You could animate that going up and down in order to generate a bit of an interest on the surface. That is quite awesome. I'm going to keep that there. I'm not going to animate it though. I think we're far too far away to get that level of interest. However, having them kind of like that is pretty awesome. You can definitely see that pattern from far away. Let's have a look. Okay, the RGB curve I've put on that has made everything go a bit too pink for my liking. So let's grab that. I think it's the other way that's going to look a bit better. Yes. Yes, it is. The fog glow, none of this is needed. Perhaps that along with the bloom was just a bit too much. So that's something to watch out for if you're switching between things. Let's find the really bright part, which was frame 300. Let's render that. Oh, that looks gorgeous now with that noise in it. Oh, really nice. Let's also change. Let's have a look at what the camera can see. I'm going to turn off overlays at this point. So how does that compare to our composite? Yeah, that's pretty close. Okay, so let's have a closer look at the bloom settings here. I think the main ones to focus on are going to be the radius to bring down that glow and not make it quite so all-encompassing of the entire scene. Maybe around 5-ish. Let's set that to 5. The intensity can probably be lowered just a little as well, but not by much. Let's try 0.03. And I don't think any of these others are going to have a massive effect, especially as the emission is set to such a high amount at 30 or 50. I'm going to increase the threshold ever so slightly though. I'm going to raise that to maybe 2.5 so it's not quite as intense again. And again, you can tweak these backwards and forwards. Obviously all the way down doesn't make much sense to have any bloom at that point. But yeah, around 5 there looks like a good value. And test it out at the various points. So 2500, that's where it fades out. So it's interesting to see what happens as it gets to a lower value. Let's go back to where the smash happens. Boom. So that's a really bright point. So maybe I do want the intensity just a little higher there. And now we've added that textural quality and this thing's looking a ton better. Let's rewind this back to the beginning and just watch that through. So the intensity grows and grows and grows. That's good. Looks like it does look like, oh, I like that. Put a bit of a soundtrack to it. Da-dun. And then we're going to leave it for ages, aren't we? And then da-dun. That's really nice. I like that. Now, the other thing that I don't like is that it's kind of not really central in the frame, so it looks off. So that's a very easy fix, of course. We can just balance it out around there. It's wobbling around the center of the frame, and we can have a look at the world as well and have it bang on center. Okay, that looks good to me. Let's turn the overlays back off again. Whoosh. So it's dying down now. Dying down. Smash. Nice. Now, I don't know whether this will play back at 60 frames per second. Let's see what the smash looks like at 60 frames per second. So here we come. That's nice. How does it look at 24 frames per second? That's going to be a bit slow-mo for us, isn't it? I suppose planets do. They are quite big. It's not going to happen. Boom. Oh, that's awesome. So the other thing, of course, Cycles is going to give us is the motion blur if we want it. We can turn on that motion blur. And then as it's going between frames, I can't remember where that was, about frame 2000. Is that where the smash happens? I am going to render mine out using Cycles, I think, so I can get that motion blur in there. And in the compositing tab, I will add back in my glare and set it to fog glow. And perhaps turn that down a little. Right, let's get to the render settings here. It is just emission, so we don't need to worry about the render settings here, quite frankly. It's all emitted light, and I think when we render as 1, it's not going to make that much difference compared to if we render at 16. We'll test it. We'll do slot 2 here. It was 128 before, wasn't it? And let's just have a look between slot 1 and slot 2. So that's slot 1, that's slot 2. 1 looks slightly smoother, but you know what? Perhaps 8. Oh yeah, between 8 and 2, I can't tell any difference. Can I tell any difference at 2 samples? Just. Let's basically get a little more resolved around these edges. So I'm going to set that back at 8 and render out the animation at 30 frames per second, step value of 1, and I'll see you back in a couple of hours. Okay, so you guys have already seen the one where we skip through every 30 frames. I did a little bit more testing. I wanted to make sure it looks just as how I wanted it to, and it does. So I've rendered out the first 10 seconds. Now, in order to render out everything else that I need, I'm going to switch over to rendering out with PNGs. I'm going to render it across multiple computers just to speed things up significantly. In order to do that, what I'm going to do is render it as PNGs. I'm going to put it on a shared drive in a shared space. So I don't want it going on ZBlender. I want it to go into my Cube Planet folder. This is a shared drive on NAS that is shared amongst multiple computers. I'm going to make sure that overwrite is turned off. Placeholders is turned on. Then I can start this instance of Blender running. I'm going to make sure my file has been saved. This one is set up to run as GPU. But what I am going to do is I'm going to shove this over to one side. I'm going to launch another instance of Blender. Here we go. Once Blender has launched, I'm going to bring it across to the other side, and I'm going to set it to the Planet Cube again. We saw it took a few seconds there to open. That's because of the size of the file. And one's CPU and one's going to be GPU. So let's just make this area a bit wider here. I'm going to set this to CPU, and I'm going to change my tile size here to 16 by 16. Then I can start this one, rendering the animation. And here we go, frame 1 done. Then I can go here, render animation. And that's using the CPU, so that's nice and quick. And they're roughly equal actually in this run, which is useful, although they are both using, and I hope this is still capturing my data properly, they are using resources that both of them would benefit from. So 17, 19, 20, excellent, this looks great. I'm going to switch this over to the file window so I can see what's going on. So if you bear with me a moment, I can bring this across. We can see it populating. I'm going to go to view list so then it can come down. I'm going to go open this up on my other computer. Be right back. And I've just realized it stopped at frame 300 because I'm a numpty. Okay, let's go to the output tab, set it at 3000. Let's save the file. Is this the right one to save? No, it's not. Let me just go pause the other computer. But this isn't a bad thing, you see, because I used PNGs. I can just resume. I've not changed anything. I'm just rendering out. Okay, so let's take this one as the source, which it is. I'm happy with that. Let's go to our output tab and set it at 3000 once again. Let's save my file so I can open it up. Now when we start the render, 301, yeah. That's perfect. That's exactly what we want to see. I'm going to shift this over to one side. I'm going to relaunch Blender, and this one is going to be set up using the CPU with, let's go down performance. Let's set this at 16. Let's click and drag so I can change them both at once. Don't need to save anything, but I do need to start the render. Now I can start it up on the other machines, and I'll switch over to the less exciting view of this lot coming in. I'll shift it along so we can start seeing them coming in, and they're coming in 2 at a time. They should be coming in 3.5 at a time in a moment. The great thing is this does not take long to actually render. So it's motoring through on both of my machines. I'm not going to employ the help of any of the other ones in the house this time round, however. But I'm quite happy to let this race through. This is 4 times faster than it was going to be. So that's a good one, and I'll see you guys back soon. Okay, so this is great. We're almost there with the rendering out, and of course this is one of the time-consuming things. In the last video that I did, I explained how you can use multiple computers to speed up this process. Whether or not you're using Eevee or Cycles, you can benefit when creating animations by utilizing multiple machines to get the job done so much quicker than you could otherwise. You can see this is almost finished off, and the last thing we'll need to do here is pop it into the video editor as an image sequence. Now I often do that in my own file rather than doing it within the file that we've been working on. I just find it's a lot easier to just take control of it and not worry about changing the settings of the file I'm working on. So let's close down everything on the right hand side, and I think I've got everything I need on the left hand side. Let's go ahead. I don't want to save anything because I haven't actually changed anything, so I must not fall into that habit, but I am going to go to new video editing, and we're not going to save any changes that we've made this time round. We're going to go to add image sequence, and when we do that we need to find out where we've put the stuff, and as you can probably guess, it's all going to be in here. Although, oh, there we go, it's just taken a few moments to populate. Start and end frame, well, this is going to be 3000. Let's just go. Yeah, add image strip. Now, of course, just like before, we're going to need to make sure that we have our ins and outs set correctly. So at the moment, frame start at 1, frame end at 3000. We've got 30 frames per second. Must remember to get that right. And then I think all we need to do is render. So let's make sure we've got the output settings set correctly. So we just need to go a bit further down here. This is going to be our output folder. I'm going to set it to the same folder that I've put all of the rest of it into. So that's fine, that's accepted. Excellent, that's appeared here. Don't need to worry about overwriting because this time we're going to use an FFmpeg video. We're going to set the encoding to an MP4. I'm going to leave everything as... I'm going to change the quality here to high quality rather than just medium. That should help out with the blockiness with the transitions, since it is quite a dark scene, and dark scenes tend to have more artifacts in them than lighter ones. I believe I have everything ready, so now it's a matter of going render animation, and you can see the speed at which this is currently going definitely means we are not rendering it out, because this is it's a 1/10 of a second per frame at this point, so it's a lot quicker than it was before. That would be like me employing another couple of computers doing this job. One day I might get round to upgrading my rig and putting a couple more graphics cards in it. Certainly not going to happen as it's a mini ITX at the moment. So that looks awesome. Here comes that molten rock whizzing past. I can't wait for that to join it. And you can see the result I've got here is far different from the result I got the first time round, or in fact not the first time round, but the one I selected to use for the title cover. It just happened to be that one was a bit more chaotic. It had more particles in it, and you could do a very similar thing using a particle system as well, but it had far more cubes in it, 7,000 looking at my notes down here, and this one's got about 1,500 I think in it. And the main reason for that is obviously the time it takes to do a tutorial. So I needed a smaller scene. Otherwise, instead of waiting tens of minutes for things to calculate and render out, they would take a lot longer because the information, the scene would be much more complex. So that's something to watch out for. If you are doing this, I would recommend that you do it with a low number of objects to begin with. Ramping it all the way up is going to certainly cost you in terms of your time and your efforts. And whilst you're practicing with this and seeing what you get, well, it's worthwhile practicing with those smaller scenes. And if you have done something like this, I'd love to see what you've come up with. Of course, once this is rendered out, I can put it up full screen and also play it along with the original as well. We've got it fading out now, and there we go, it's finished. So I'll put up the final version here for you now. Okay, thanks a lot for joining me, guys. I hope you've stuck around and you've learned a lot as we've gone through this. I hope it wasn't too long as well. It's one of my bigger videos that I think I've ever sat down and done. So thank you for sticking along with it. If you've enjoyed it and found it useful, give us a thumbs up. And remember, if you subscribe to the channel, you'll know when the next thing comes out. Take care, and I'll leave some links around for other videos you might be interested in. Take care.